Thanks, Marshall.
Well, thank you, Tom. I appreciate it, and thank you and the team at Chapman University for hosting this really great conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about what is on everybody's mind, which is, first of all, is there such a thing as a world post-COVID? And second is, what is it going to be like? And to help us with that, we've assembled a panel from across the globe. People who have unique insight into every continent and every society that make up our planet. We have first Laure Mandeville, who's the senior reporter at the French newspaper Le Figaro, where she covers American and European affairs, as well as intellectual debates around the world. She joined the foreign desk of Le Figaro in 1989 to cover the end of communism, spent 20 years covering post-Soviet world. She was the Russia bureau chief in Moscow from 1997 to 2000, and then the US bureau chief in Washington from 2008 to 2016. She's the co-founder of the Tocqueville Conversations, an annual conference on the future of our democracies, and a member of the board of the Tocqueville Foundation. Second, we have Dr. Lee Sun. Dr. Lee is a lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of Leeds in the UK. Prior to moving to the UK, she worked at universities in Germany, Netherlands, the US, and China. And beyond her academic positions, Dr. Sun also, Dr. Lee serves as a consultant to the UN, World Bank, and OECD, as well as various government offices in the UK, Netherlands, and China. Her main research interest is urbanization and governance in China, including the rural to urban migration and social policies and land and housing issues. Her latest book, entitled Rural Urban Migration and Policy Intervention in China, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. Behki Mahlobo joins us from Johannesburg. He's an analyst and economic researcher at the Center for Risk Analysis. He's primarily involved in writing for the Socioeconomic Survey of South Africa, an annual publication that provides information and data on major trends that are affecting both various social and economic fields. The Center for Risk Analysis is one of the top think tanks in South Africa that provides analysis and advice on scenario planning and macroeconomic strategic advice on South African risks, as well as global trends for corporations and individuals. We're also joined by Richard Florida. Richard, thank you for being here. Richard is one of the world's leading urbanists. He's a researcher and professor, serving as university professor at the University of Toronto School of Cities and the Rotman School of Management, and a faculty chair at NYU's Schack School for Real Estate. He's a writer and a journalist, and having penned several global bestsellers, including the award-winning The Rise of the Creative Class, and his most recent book, The New Urban Crisis. And finally, Joel Kotkin. Known as America's demographer, Joel is presidential fellow at Chapman University and director of the Center of Demographics and Policy, author of 10 books. Joel's most recent book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class, was published last year. Joel is my co-host on the wildly popular Feudal Future podcast and my fellow researcher on the topic of the state of the middle class. So welcome, panelists. We're delighted you're here. Why don't we start with Richard and get your take on all of this?
You're muted.
Sorry about that. The microphone unmute button is too tough for me. Well, thank you so much. And I'll just be brief and say thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you to Joel. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Chapman for hosting this. Look, I think we kind of hoped we'd been out of this, right, by now, but we're not, and we're in yet another wave. And I think we're coming to learn we have to live with it. You know, Joel and I have been working on this independently and together for a while. We wrote a really interesting piece together for City Journal that came out of our work, well, our colleagueship for a long time, but also our work for the Heartland Forward think tank, where we combined forces on developing a post-COVID strategy for Northwest Arkansas. And look, I think that what COVID did is accelerate. It didn't so much disrupt, but accelerate a lot of trends already underway. What's really, really interesting is that it has certainly caused many people, and I think the big shift with COVID-19 is the shift to remote work. And our estimates are now that roughly a fifth of workdays will be done remotely post-pandemic. Hard to say for sure, but and what that has done is I think remote work can be seen as yet another technology like the streetcar or the commuter train or the automobile or the bus that allows one to stretch the boundaries of metro areas. So it's allowed the metro area to encompass now what used to be thought as beautiful, wonderful rural hinterlands, natural areas. And so I think around superstar cities, especially, which are super expensive, there has been, and there's long been a preference among lots of kind of artistic people or creative people or people who think themselves that way, not only for urban areas, but for rural areas. That's a big stream in American history with the Hudson River Valley painters and Bob Dylan. And anyway, so I think we've seen some of this rural decampment to these lovely rural towns along waterfronts or mountaintops and so on and so forth. But we've also seen, according to the most recent census data, that cities grew more than we expected. And I think one group that's been a little bit penalized has been the close-in older suburbs that have not built enough. So that's one thing. But I think and it's enabled some smaller cities. Joel and I know a lot about Bentonville, Tulsa with its Tulsa Remote, and others to begin to really grow again. I think the second thing that's reinforced the Southern shift, I think that for a variety of reasons, not just affordability and taxes, being able to be outside, and also being able to be free of COVID restrictions and be able to send your kids to school has had a lot to do with that. So we've seen kind of a Sunbelt shift generally with then higher net worth people and tech people preferring Austin and Miami, say, more than they would have a few years ago. But I think the big shift is in the organization and geography of work. And I think the big challenge, which we can talk more about post-COVID, is the central business districts, which I have called sort of the last gasp of industrial age organization. They were kind of like factories for office work and information work and knowledge work, where you packed and stacked knowledge workers in these giant towers and kind of trapped them at their desk, either because of fiat or fear. I think that the central business districts are going to be very challenged. That 20% is a big percent. I forget the exact numbers, but we're looking at at least a 10% decline in demand for office space across the board, bigger losses in bigger centers. And at least a 5% decline in spending. So I think that remaking those central business districts and the dispersion of work is the biggest probably trend I see.
Marshall?
That, I had myself muted there. Thank you, Richard.
Turn your video back on too, Marshall.
Oh, there we go.
There you
Thank you very much. Thanks for your thoughts, Richard. It's interesting to see, how the differences between very dense places like Manhattan and places like Bentonville and Rogers, Arkansas, still focus around the notion of lighting back up kind of commercial activity. Joel, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think what Richard said on the geography issues is right on target. What I want to maybe shift it a little towards is the discussion of class, because one of the things that's been very clear is, and this is not true, and I'm sure, not true just here, I'm sure it's true in France, it probably to some extent in China and even in Africa. The key thing here seems to be that the lockdowns in particular were very tough on small business people. About a third of American small businesses are on the verge of bankruptcy or going bankrupt. And the service workers, the people who work in the hotels. And I'm sure every time we go through another report of another surge, these people know their livelihoods are being undermined. So that, I think, is a big question here. I think it had a lot to do with what happened in the United States last summer. Laura and I were talking about the fact that, you have protests in France, because the French are great at protesting, which, that's not bad. My wife's family's French, so I'm not at all being negative. But the other thing, and I think really important, is this class divide getting worse, because people like us, we can work from home. Everybody on this panel can thrive in a digitally dominated economy. Most people can't. And then what I'd like to do is, as we move on with the panel, is how this is playing out around the world, and particularly in, let's face it, you can't talk about urbanism in the 21st century without talking about Africa and China, for absolute sure, because that's where the big cities are going to be. This is where the action is going to be. The fate of the planet, I think, is basically going to end up being determined in Africa, just because of the population. And we have to resolve many issues. So I think that the class element of COVID, how it accelerated, as Rich talked about, how it accelerated things, for instance, in geography, what areas are doing better, where were people living, it also is going to have an enormous impact on the global economy and how cities function around the world. And that's one of the things I'm very excited to hear about.
Yeah, and you know, perhaps a good starting point would be the notion that Richard brought up at the beginning of his remarks, which is that we're kind of coming to the point where we're thinking that we're going to just have to live with this for a long time, as opposed to beat COVID. Is that something that's shared around the world? Laure, how about in Europe? What's the sense?
Yeah, indeed. I think you're totally right to say that, because, you know, talking about the world after COVID actually is very difficult, because people get the sense that COVID is not leaving us, or even that we, in a way, maybe because of our fears and you know, and this huge crisis of the West, which actually was prior to COVID, but has been in some ways aggravated. We are also being trapped by COVID and sort of not wanting, in a way, to leave the protections that have been suddenly erected against COVID. That it's very difficult to get to the point when we think, indeed, as some already said, that we're going to have to live with it. And so for me, what I wanted to strike, of course, everything you've said is absolutely right in terms of, you know, the importance of the, you know, virtual world, you know, the way, you know, technology is going to change, totally has changed, you know, the way people are thinking through how they're going to work. You know, a lot of people in France are now thinking of, you know, migrating to the countryside and work from there, and they're doing it already. The prices of houses outside of Paris has just gone up, you know, tremendously. And in, you know, smaller cities, you know, there is a boom. People are searching for houses. I mean, there is a huge change sort of in the making, and the companies still don't know exactly what they are supposed to do with that. You know, they are, I mean, I saw in the Figaro, for instance, you know, these sort of warnings that you have to come back, and you're going to have to come back, but they're already thinking through, should we stay in the middle of Paris? Should we move maybe to smaller kind of environments, et cetera, et cetera. But what I wanted to stress was more, you know, the sort of some adjectives that are going to be with Europeans, according to me, in the coming years. And the first one, of course, is not something new, but it's more the aggravation, as Richard said, of what was happening before. It's the word, of course, Europe divided Europe. So it seems that this pandemic has, in fact, has been a tale of two pandemics, I think, has, you know, Ivan Krastev coined on a recent paper on the side of the ECFR, you know, the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he sort of showed that, you know, on the basis of polls and results that, you know, the North and the West of Europe actually say, a majority of the people say that COVID has not had so much of an impact on their lives. You know, they are making it and they're getting out of it. And there's been a lot of help, you know, in countries like France, for business, for small business, you were mentioning, Joel, and the east of Europe and west and south of Europe, which have been very much impacted, you know, negatively by COVID, and have suffered tremendously in terms of economics and also in terms of health as well. More so than we did. And so that's the first thing. And also, they are underlining this sort of huge growing divide that we're seeing between the youth and the old generation. And that it seems to be, ripe with a potential big tension, because the youth, which actually accepted all of this, lockdowns and isolation and everything, it really thinks now that they have been the victims of this whole pandemic, because they've sacrificed a big part of their life, of their studies, of everything. And there is a growing anger at the fact that the government seems to be wanting to maintain, regulations and rules and more, and new vaccination and fourth wave and third shot, etc. And I think there is a growing rift between the old people and the young people about that. So that's, the divide and also what was before COVID was the distrust. I mean, the sort of huge rift that we saw in the years before, and this populist wave and Trump in the US and the Gilets jaunes and, and what happened in different countries, in the Netherlands, and it's this idea that, the elites are totally out of their mind, that they are plotting some kind of strange, way of governing, and this rift is very strong, actually. In France, it's absolutely incredible to what extent, the distrust of the way the government is handling the crisis. It's rising enormously, and Macron has become just hated, although, is it okay? Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, so yeah, we can hear you quite well.
Yes, and so there is I would say, together with the fear, there is this sort of revolutionary mood, which is growing. It's not going anywhere, which was present before COVID, but I think is being aggravated by this sort of anti-vaccination movements and the huge importance in the virtual world of now this sort of what I call the mental secessions of big segments of the population, not trusting a word of what is being said on TV, underlining all the the different contradictions, which were indeed very many. I mean, there were lots of mistakes, so they are just pointing them, and there is a revolutionary mood, pre-revolutionary mood, not only in France, by the way, but all over. Can you imagine that in Germany, of all countries, they are in a way trusting the government, but at the same time they're saying that they have 49% of the population is feeling they are unfree. 49% of the population, they're furious at the regulation. I mean, it's very strong, and I think that there is also this sort of geopolitical, that there is this individual loneliness, which is very strong because of COVID, but it's also, coupled with I would say, a geopolitical loneliness, that the Europeans are very worried actually about the world. They have the feeling that, America is going away. America is in a disastrous situation. They're seeing Afghanistan, they're seeing what happened with the way they handled the crisis. They have this sort of catastrophic view of America now, and also a big fear of China. So they are feeling very lonely geopolitically and very fragile. And I would say that maybe the only sort of more optimistic element is that there is a sort of pragmatism, nevertheless. So then you have of course all the nationalists are still there. The supporters of federalism are gone. I would say nobody believes that Europe is able to handle, is going to become a federal, state now. But people are willing to use Europe to sort of get out of the crisis. So it's in between. There is a pragmatism of not killing Europe and using it to strengthen the states. And
we're seeing, if I can summarize for what you're saying, we're seeing the challenge and possible destruction of existing views toward the elite and toward the group that has been in charge for the past 70 years, and the assumption that the government or the groups that have set these policies still have the right to manage people's individual behavior. Are we seeing that being challenged elsewhere? Behki and Lee, I'm particularly interested in hearing what's happening both in Africa, where maybe some of these institutions are a little less well developed, and in China, where the trust in government policy has been much stronger. So why don't we start with you, Behki, and give us a sense of what's happening in Africa?
Yeah, thank you so much, Marshall. Before I answer your question, there's something that Joel referred to that I 100% agree with, and that is Africa in the long term. And I'd like to essentially divide this question into two sets, in the short term as well as that in the long term, which will then answer the question that you've just asked me. And important thing to know is that Africa is a very, it's not a homogeneous continent. It's made up of 54 countries. Even in South Africa, there's about 11 official languages, and within those 11 official languages, there's different tribes and different customs that each of those languages follow. And what's particularly interesting here is that we have seen a pushback at some of the regulations in terms of the COVID-19, in response to the COVID-19 measures, in terms of what we see in small businesses. But what I would like to make clear for you is that in order for Africa to see it a prosperous continent in the future, let's deal with what's the reason for Africa being in such a poor state that it currently is. And it's because of the following: property rights, the rule of law, freedom of trade and speech. These are institutions that are fundamental to a prosperous country and a prosperous continent. And what we see in Africa is that these institutions have been fundamentally weakened by the governments that govern some of these continents in Africa. And if you don't mind, Marshall, may I just share my screen to just, thank you. Let me just share my screen.
Sure, be my guest.
Can you see my screen? Oh, wait 2 seconds there. Sorry about that.
Yep, we see it, or we saw it.
Okay. How about now? Do you see it?
Yes.
And put it in presentation mode also.
Right.
There we go. There's a presentation mode, and can you
There
see
you
the
go.
laser pointer here? The one thing that I'd like to note to you is that I'm very much pessimistic about what I see in Africa in the short term, but very much optimistic into the prospects of Africa. And it's largely due to what I see as a point that I linked to earlier, is that fundamentally what we're seeing in Africa, as well as that in South Africa, is the fundamental weakening of the institutions of private property, the rule of law, freedom of trade, as well as that of freedom of speech, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, to a certain extent, this has been exacerbated in terms of regulations that we've seen by the South African government, as well as that of other African countries when you look at informal traders. And we see this by looking at the economic freedom of the world index for African countries for this year, produced by the Heritage Foundation. This is an index made up of 10 sections, which largely tracks the institutions that I've linked to earlier. And what you see here, this rank is out of 180 countries. And what you'll notice here is that predominantly African countries ranked the highest in this category, rather the lowest in this category, meaning that they fundamentally have weak institutions that of private property, as well as of that of rule of law, freedom of trade, and that of free speech. And what is the consequence of that when you have such weakened institutions? It results in massive levels of poverty, which you see here by looking at the GDP per capita for selected countries from 1990 until 2020. And I've broken this up into predominantly about 5 regions: Africa Eastern and Southern, Africa Western and Central, South Africa, upper middle income, as well as the world. And what you see here is that countries that predominantly rank the lowest in the economic freedom index are the ones that have the lowest productivity levels, as well as the declining in living standards. Whereas countries like South Africa, when you compare to other countries, has a better ranking compared to other African countries, but is on a great decline. You see it perform largely better compared to other African countries, which you can see as the orange line from 1990 until 2020. The reason why I included South Africa here is because of the following reason. Under the leadership of Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, in the early years of South Africa's democracy from 1994 until 2007, South Africa experienced its highest levels of GDP performance, where GDP performance averaged about 3 to 5%. That resulted in the doubling of people employed, an increase in urbanization levels, as well as that of an increase in living standards in the country. Indicators such as that of service delivery increased by levels of about 200%. And that resulted in an increase in the living standards of the average South African, which you can see as the line increased from 1994 until 2007. That was achieved by strong institutions and not attacking these institutions that I've linked to earlier as I started. Subsequent to that period, a change of administration and a change of thinking within that of the ANC towards more of a state-driven ANC, what has resulted is the attacking of these institutions, which has resulted in a decline in living standards in the country, which you can see after the financial crisis to where we find ourselves today. And what we see coming from COVID-19 is that COVID-19 did not necessarily signal to the government to make a U-turn in terms of hostile policy, as well as that of other African countries, which you see on your screen. In fact, it's largely it hasn't changed anything, and to a certain extent exacerbated the regulations that we've seen from governments around African countries, which has made Africa lag behind what we see in other emerging countries in terms of employment numbers, as well as income levels. So the picture is quite dire in the short term. However, in the long term, what I would note for you is that the average African is moderate in their way of thinking and is not, and the way in which African governments govern is, and the policies that they implement are not aligned with what the average African wants. And another important note to note, I think Joel even touched on this, is the young demographic of Africans currently compared to other countries that we see in the world, which would mean that an increase in productivity in the future. That increase in productivity in the future can be capitalized by having strong institutions, which currently Africa does not hold.
So let me just ask you, and interrupt you if you don't mind, Behki,
sure.
about when you talk about average Africans and their aspirations.
Yes.
How has COVID changed the desire or changed those aspirations from a, let's say, urbanization perspective?
From an urbanization perspective, what we have seen essentially is that the people that are available to work from home prefer to then move away from cities and live close by their families, right? That's what we see. That's largely in middle income classroom. However, the impact of the COVID-19, the pandemic, as well as the lockdowns of it, has resulted in an increase in unemployment, particularly in the categories of the low-skilled and low-educated categories. We see this in South Africa. In fact, we had employment numbers come as of last week, which we've seen an increase of about 1.6 million South Africans that are unemployed. That's under the expanded definition, and we have a youth unemployment rate of about 75% under the expanded definition, which includes discouraged work seekers. These are people that have given up the aspirations of employment. And this is a dangerous trend that we see in South Africa today as incentive risk analysis, is that we have a great proportion of South Africans giving up the aspirations of employment, largely due to employment opportunities in the country being on a great decline due to the policies implemented by the ruling government.
Well, and of course, so much of that employment is centered in cities.
Exactly.
And so, the impact of COVID with kind of the migratory patterns of people coming from the countryside into the city, clearly COVID is having, who knows what the impact is going to be, but it's obviously going to be something. My sense is that in China, which has really focused over the past 25 years on moving people from the countryside to urban centers, is particularly vulnerable to this particular trend. Lee, what are you observing?
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. I think what China experienced during the COVID is quite similar as Rachel talked about the digital society. Many people are able to working from home in cities, but many migrant workers who are helping with those people with food delivery and with online shopping. So you can clearly say, like Joe said, the class differentiations under the COVID. So actually, I prepared some slides and I highlight the opportunity and the challenges China will be facing after COVID. Should I share my slides?
Yes, please. I'm sorry, I muted myself. There you go.
So the first point I want to address is a digital China, because nowadays there are more than 850 million internet users in China, and COVID is exactly accelerating the digital China in the dimension of e-commerce, e-health, and also online learning, working from home, and e-governance. And regarding e-commerce, maybe some of you already know, China is the world's largest e-commerce market. So I got the recent data only in 2018. China accounts for 45% of the global retail e-commerce transaction value. And also from the figure, you can see in 2019, e-commerce account for 24% of the total retail value share in China, compared to 11% in the US and 9% in Germany. So you can say e-commerce is really very popular, especially in Chinese cities. And the second opportunity, I would say, because of COVID, is the role of the private sector, and also the potential of the private-public partnership. You can well remember, like in 2003, during the SARS break, and China is more dominated by the state-owned enterprise. That's more public sectors, accounted for 55% of China's asset. But nowadays, the private sector made up 2/3 of China's economic growth and made up 90% as the new jobs. So we think the COVID also promotes the rise of the private sector even further in the coming years. And the third dimension is the research and development. From this figure, in 2020, you see China spending 2.4% of the GDP in the research and development. And it recently announced in between 2021 and 2025, such spending will increase even by more than 7% every year, which more in the field of AI, big data, clean energy, and also life science. And the fourth dimension will be the urbanization, what you have been talking a lot in African countries. And in China, so you can say the urbanization rate in the past 4 decades has been increased dramatically. In 1980s, that's around I was born, only 20% of Chinese living in cities. So I was one of the 80% living in villages. But after 4 decades, now around 64% Chinese are living in cities. And it even estimated by 2035, 17% of Chinese will be living in an urban area. So you can say the urbanization will be continuing in the post-COVID stage. So I have been talking about those opportunities in terms of the digitalization, the role of the private sector, and also research development and the urbanization. But I want to highlight several challenges China will face in the coming years. The first one is the digital divide between the rural and urban. Like I mentioned, many people working from home, but they are in cities. But still, there are around 14% of Chinese living in the rural area. But the poor digital infrastructure in villages and also the low level of the ICT equipment around the rural household are really concerning. For example, the number of the computer per 100 household is only 27.5 in rural China compared to 72.2 in cities. So you can clearly see the digital divide between the city and the village. And the second challenge is the aging society. In 2020, the number of people aged 16 and above, which is classified as elderly people in China, reached 264 million. That's around 18.7% of the total population. And even by 2025, the number will be reached 300 million. So by then, around 1/5 of Chinese will be elderly. So elderly care is a really pressing issue for China's coming decades. The third challenge is a low fertility rate. The population grew in these decades at its lowest rate since 1950s. And the estimated fertility rate now is only 1.3 in China, which is way below the replacement rate of 2.1. So in May this year, the Chinese government announced the 3-child policy. Maybe you have already been reading this news. And the fourth challenge is unequal social and welfare policy, because urban residents, rural to urban migrants, and the rural residents, they have the differentiated social welfare system. And as I write in my book, especially for the 291 million rural to urban migrant workers, although they live and work in cities, but they are largely excluded from the urban social insurance system. For example, normally they are not entitled to enjoy the urban medical insurance or the urban pension. So all of those challenges will be testing China's future development in the coming years or decades.
Just one quick thing, Lisa, I just wanted to ask, has COVID made these divides, which the West has almost no knowledge of, has it made it worse as it appears to be in South Africa and in Europe? And is there any sign of Chinese urban people looking for alternatives the way they are in France and elsewhere?
So actually, I think in the short term, in 2020, it made worse because many migrant workers, they returned to hometown and they become unemployed. But as you know, China quickly contained the COVID, and then they are able to went back to cities to continue engaging in the urban employment. So in the short term, yes, it was worse, but currently the situation is getting better. Yeah.
What I'm hearing as a thread is actually hearing kind of a conflict between, or a difference between, what's happening in China and elsewhere. What I'm hearing from Europe, Africa, from America is kind of the challenging of central authority and what sounds to me like a move toward hyper-localism in terms of people wanting to control their own lives. Whereas I don't hear that as a theme in China. I still hear centralized planning and the desire to move people en masse from one place to another based on centralized government policy. Do you believe that those same kinds of pressures are apparent in China, we just don't see them? Or what's your sense of that?
So I think centralization, especially during the COVID, it was true because central government has any policy, then the provincial or the municipal government quickly follow this policy. That's Chinese officials believe it was a good way to help them to contain this, because every city and province can coordinate together, follow the regulation from the central government. But meanwhile, we can say the booming of the volunteer or the civil society in China, because people start to get together to help with each other, which was not so common to find before COVID. And what we call like social institution and the power of the civil society, those are emerging now.
And do we think, and this is for all of you, all of the panelists, Are we on the cusp of a major shift in how people are governed? Richard, you want to, or Laure, do you want to start us off on
Yeah,
that?
I'll start. I'll go small bore. And by the way, I appreciated the global picture. And one thing I will say about the United States is that it is, I wouldn't say it's uniquely suburban, but we have a lot of metropolitan areas, 350 plus, a lot of micropolitan areas, and a lot of suburban differentiation. So some people would have said that's a disadvantage, right? Density, some urban economists would say, well, density and having big king cities is great. Toronto's about 20% of GDP. London's about a third of GDP. Seoul's about 50% of Korean GDP. New York's about 10% of US GDP. So the US spatial structure is just really different than just about anywhere else. Although China's is very interesting with lots and lots of big cities. So that said, I'll go that big point, I'll make a more micro point. I think the issue of governance is the primary factor driving migration in COVID. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. I think for many people, they believe that it's affordability, and I think that's a big, big one. But I think that was been the case. I think affordability is a trend that has been going on for at least a decade, half decade to a decade. I think a preference for open space and warmth, but that, Ed Glazer a long time ago said, sun, skills, and sprawl are what drive the American way. So, and Joel has made similar points, right? But what I see happening, particularly with the rise of places like Austin and Miami and many others, is that it's not just lower taxes. I know this sounds kind of counterintuitive to some, because you would think you'd see a migration to safer, healthier places that have more stringent public health measures. But in fact, we see the exact opposite. That at least in the United States, there is a movement towards the ability to live my life, to put my kids in school, to exert my personal freedom and liberty. Now, I'm not trying to make a value judgment on that, whether I believe that's true or not. But certainly when we look at high net worth people like hedge fund managers, investment fund managers, real estate developers, venture capitalists, and entrepreneurs who tend to skew more libertarian, when you talk to them, that's what they say. Yeah, Austin and Miami have low taxes, but they're more open, they're more free. They're not going to lock me down. They're not going to restrict me. So I think in a perplexing way, people are saying, at least Americans, and I would love to see if this is true anywhere else, that I will manage my own risk profile. I'm not going to go running around like a crazy person, but I feel more comfortable managing my own risk profile and living in a place which allows me to make that decision. So I do think, and there's at least one study, I forget the authors of the study, it's an NBER study, that suggests that this movement away from stringency was the word they used, the stringency is a factor in post-pandemic or interim pandemic and post-pandemic moves. So I think governance does play a bigger role than many people think.
And Behki, we're going to reward politeness because you put your hand up electronically. So we're going to go to you next.
So it's just answering the question of governance. The fundamental problem that we have in South Africa is actually the failure of governance. And the consequence of that, and what we've seen, is an increase in localization, as well as that of gated communities. In fact, I think it's actually quite an extreme and crazy idea when I tell you that in South Africa, we have more private security forces protecting homes than we do have public police services. That's because of the decline in the service delivery and the incompetence of the ruling government, largely because of the policies that they implement. But as a consequence to that, what we have seen is an increase in localization, an increase in communities depending on themselves and not particularly that of the state to essentially, for example, whether it is pavement of roads, fixing the pavement of roads, as well as that of security. This is a trend that I see in South Africa in predominantly middle-income class societies, but as well as lower-income class societies, such as that of Soweto. A prime example of this is what happened a month ago, when you saw an increase in the number of looting and riots in the country, largely due to the desperation and frustration of South Africans, where we saw a lot of people looting shops in particular communities, predominantly in the provinces of Gauteng, as well as that of KZN. And what we saw was that the police was utterly overwhelmed and unable to control the situation that was occurring. And a direct opposite of what we saw is that we saw communities take on matters to their own hand. There is, of course, a negative aspect to that where it gets too far, as some of the things that we've seen in Phoenix in terms of people getting shot at, unduly so. But what we've seen is that the communities have taken it upon themselves to then protect themselves. So there's then an increase in the distrust of government and an increase in trust within the communities themselves.
Right now, I know Joel and Richard want to jump in, but I want to hear from Laure, because Europe is the home of state-sponsored, social welfare and safety nets. And I'm just dying to know, whether or not people are rejecting that and they're looking at their local community for support, or whether or not this trend will continue in Europe. You are muted, actually, Laure. No?
Yes, I was listening to Richard and was actually, since I traveled a lot throughout the US, I really thought his point was right concerning sort of willingness of the Americans to sort of move out of places like California and just go to places where indeed their libertarian instincts are being easier or more recognized. And one has to say that indeed Europe is very different and France is very different. But France, what I find interesting in France is that there is actually, to me, there is a tension between different currents happening at the same time. I think there is a very, actually I find a bit disturbing personally, trend, which is actually the trend of the people who want the government to do more, who think the government hasn't been, stringent enough, and a sort of segment of the population, they are ready to actually, go against their fellow citizens, and sometimes even, aggress them in some ways because they are not totally submitting to some of the rules, in the street. I mean, I think there are some signals of some kind of intolerance, which is growing, sort of this whole COVID thing becoming a new space for big, big fighting, which is in the spirit of the time, right? And on the other hand, you have, so these people are actually, they want the government, they want to rely on the government. And to our surprise, to my surprise, for instance, I was, for instance, I can tell you, quite horrified by some of the rules edicted by the French government at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were not allowed to go, beyond 1 kilometer when we were walking around our house. And I thought this was just absolutely ridiculous. But some of the people, if you would, not wear the mask when they decided the mask was necessary, would look at you, even if you were in the middle of the countryside, would look at you with this sort of really angry, way. And so there is this, and there is the other part, which is growing, I think, especially among the young people, I would say, who are becoming more libertarian and who are actually thinking, what is this government which has been contradicted itself at each step of this pandemic, and lying bluntly about some of the issues, saying that masks were not necessary because actually they didn't have them, for instance, and then other, there were lots of contradictions and then back and forth, which of course, I mean, it was maybe inevitable because of the nature of this virus, so we didn't know. But what I feel is that there is also an interesting willingness to go local, and sort of what we call the Girondin, no more the Jacobin model of deciding everything in Paris, but sort of reinvention, willingness to reinvent a new way of life, more in line with also with the ecological considerations, local circuits, new type of agriculture, ending this sort of crazy, trade, which was not so. So actually, sort of some of the themes that the populists pushed, but I would say in this reindustrialization mode and let's be rational and small. Let's think smaller and maybe better.
Richard, are you seeing this in Canada? By the way, are you seeing or is Canada and the US diverging in the way of handling this?
I think almost they're complete diametric opposites, although there are a lot of people in Canada blanching at restrictions. And actually, Trudeau called for an election. And it looks like it's not going as well as he thought it might, partly because of this. But I think there is much more social cohesion in Canada, even though it's an immigrant country and, Toronto is a city more than 50% foreign born. For some reason, there's more of a willingness to follow orders and to be cohesive. But in the US, I think there's an additional dimension that is something Behki said. And it's very interesting to see such parallels between his part of Africa and my part of the United States. Canada has seen some rise in crime. Like we had a car stolen. So there has been an increase in property crime as people get entrepreneurial, and many people in my neighborhood got their car stolen. So now you put that ridiculous club on it that you never put on it before. But we've seen no uptick in violent crime. When I talk to political leadership in the United States, and particularly in New York, like Joel, I'm from he's from New York City, I'm from the Newark area, and in Miami where I winter. And I was just on the phone with the political leadership of Miami and Miami Beach yesterday. People are apoplectic about the rise of crime and disorder, what I would call urban disorder. It's a whole range of things, not just a shooting. People partying in Washington Square Garden, people partying like crazy on Ocean Drive in Miami, an uptick in petty theft, just a sense of sometimes people lump in protest, I'm not sure you would, a sense of unruliness and disorder, fear, women being particularly fearful to use the subway, to walk alone at night. And I think this is unique, maybe unique to the United States among the advanced countries. And that is causing not only this sense of libertarianism, but for the first time in a long time, law and order. There is definitely a sense that law and order candidates, and I guess, and Joel, I'd love to hear your comments on this, particularly in New York with the election of Eric Adams, that there is, for the first time in a long time, maybe because crime had been down, this sense that people want to vote for law and order and away from disorder. So I just think that's a very interesting difference in the United States than Canada.
If I may, I would just say that in France, I wouldn't be surprised that we see this law and order, type of maybe candidate. I mean, I feel that there is in the society an expectation and a longing, I would say, sort of not totally maybe conscious for a strong hand and a law and order candidate also coming.
I think you may be talking about two different types of strong hands. One is the sort of, whether it's on climate later, but certainly with COVID. I mean, like my favorite thing is the people who are driving their cars with their masks on when they're by themselves and always wondering were you worried about your steering wheel? But be that as it may, I do think there are two things happening, and Rich is onto some of it, which is people are rebelling, and maybe even in Canada, my wife's Canadian, they're not all willing to accept dictatorships. But you've got that, and then you've got this other reaction of, people they just can't, they absolutely have to have everything controlled. And of course, the dangerous thing in a constitutional situation, whether in France or US or in South Africa, it doesn't quite apply to China. China was a dictatorship from the beginning, but one of the things that we're seeing is that the COVID restrictions are pushing against the very structure of how we run our lives in our communities. Not saying the policies are wrong, I'm just saying it's going to have an impact. People at some point are going to say, what do you mean I can't go to the beach? When there's virtually no chance that anything is going to happen to you by going to the beach. So I think what's going to be interesting is how does this play out politically? And it may play out in a bifurcated way.
Well, and you know, it's interesting, the growth of social media and the ability of people to disintermediate how they opine in the world, right? And basically directly communicate with every other human on the planet empowers people to be thinking about their own personal liberties and freedoms to do things. And it's reinforced dozens of times a day, so that when people are suddenly receiving restrictions from them, you know, from the top, from outside of themselves, it suddenly is feeling quite foreign. And so, you know, fascinating. And you look at the differences between the Western access to social media and Chinese access to social media, and it may explain some of the differences in these pressures for hyper-localism. Now we have we have a limited time left. We had a couple of questions. First one is for Behki, and that is, can the increase in localization that you discussed result in the reorganization of national borders that make more cultural or tribal sense in Africa? Do you think that's going to be happening? And if you wouldn't mind answering quickly, we appreciate it.
Yeah, so in terms of localization, that was localization in terms of communities, in terms of having gated communities, having high fences and so forth. I do believe that we'll still see a strong national border in South Africa, as well as other African countries. Particularly what we see actually is that when you have periods of declining living standards, unfortunately, that is accompanied by an increase in xenophobic attacks. So I think that's where the second part of the question is actually asking. But predominantly, the average South African is not that violently inclined and that xenophobically inclined. It's very moderate individual that would like to see South Africa succeed, as well as the fellow countrymen and women.
Right. And our good friend Steve Roski had a quick factual question for Lee Sun. Has the percentage ownership of business assets by the state in China gone up over the past 25 years or down?
I think the state-owned enterprise share is going down. But what's happening now, because of the private sector is going up, obviously the government won't let the private sectors become huge, right? So now the government is promoting the public-private partnership, because the central resources like the oil industry, like the electricity industry, the public transport industry are still state-owned, but they are promote the PPP to encourage the engagement of the private sector.
Thank you. And Joel, I'm going to flip it to you for some final thoughts on trends that you're seeing.
Well, basically, I just, first of all, I learned a lot from this. And, you know, getting the views, you know, we tend to be obsessed with what's happening in the US, but there do seem to me to be several things. A political ramification, which we may even see in Canada, given that Trudeau is not doing as well as he thought he was going to do. But, you know, there is going to be this sort of politicization of the issue of COVID and increasing the divides. The other big thing is the economic, which is clearly COVID has been an accelerator of class division. And I personally believe class division and the lack of hope for the, you know, for the, let's say, bottom half of the population is the single greatest issue facing us. COVID has made it worse. It didn't create it. And I think the reasons now to address that issue first and foremost have never been greater.
Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us, panelists. We are just delighted to have you with us. These are, and here's a bald-faced promotion, these are topics that we talk about regularly on the Feudal Future podcast. So we encourage you to subscribe to that. And everyone on this call from a panelist point of view, either has been or will shortly be guests on the Feudal Future podcast. So you'll be able to drill down and get some more insight into the topics that we're talking about. Clearly, we're on the cusp of serious change. And thank you all for helping to illuminate those topics. And Tom, thank you and Chapman University for giving us the venue.
Okay. Thanks, Marshall. Thanks to all the panelists and thanks for all the participants. Have a great day, everybody.
Great, thank
you.
you.